When you do a ketogenic diet in an older individual, what you see is that they maintain their oxidative muscle fibers better. So those are the ones with lots of mitochondria. And those muscle fibers stay bigger and stronger. And in the absence of exercise training, animals on a ketogenic diet are able to actually, in old situation, are actually performing, and their strength is at the same level as an animal who's on a ADA compliant diet.
Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. This is Buck Joffrey, and today we have a very interesting podcast with Dr. Keith Baar. This is a podcast that's really about exercise and sort of what happens at the cellular level. And what I think is of particular interest, and where I'd like you to focus your attention on, is the story behind mTOR. Okay, that is mammalian target of rapamycin. And this is an incredibly important protein and a receptor, basically, that acts as a switch, basically going from anabolic to catabolic states, basically either building stuff like muscle and all that, or, breaking stuff down, cellular senescence, autophagy, that kind of thing, breaking up, like eating up all those cellular senescent cells and all that stuff. As it turns out, in the literature, is mTOR's downregulation, in other words, inhibiting mTOR with rapamycin, has been one of the most successful ways of getting species to live longer. Now, this becomes really interesting because, well, as you'll hear in this podcast, mTOR is actually really important for the growth of muscle. And we know that lean muscle mass is one of the biggest predictors of longevity in human beings. So what do you do? You're going to increase mTOR if you're, building muscle, but at the same time, that's somehow going to make you live less long. The whole issue has been very confusing, and I was confused by it for a long time. It's a complicated issue. However, Dr. Baar, once and for all, cleared up this confusion for me. In addition to that, we explore how different diets, like, the ketogenic diets, affect muscle and health and longevity. So bottom line is that this podcast is going to help you make a lot of sense of some of these pathways and how diet and exercise affects them. And we will have that right after these messages. Hey, longevity enthusiasts, it's time to take it to the next level. I've been fine-tuning my longevity regimen for years, and I look better and feel better than I did a decade ago. In fact, my blood work is even better than it was back then. And it's all because of my data-driven regimen, and it's inspired me to create a course and community just for you. It's called the Longevity Roadmap, and I urge you to check it out. If you're tired of your belly fat, tired of being tired, or just want to optimize yourself for the next 50 years, visit longevityroadmap.com. That's longevityroadmap.com. Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. Today, my guest is Dr. Keith Baar, who is a renowned professor at the University of California, Davis, where he holds joint appointments in neurobiology, physiology, and behavior, and physiology and membrane biology. He leads a cutting-edge research laboratory there dedicated to unraveling the molecular mechanisms that govern musculoskeletal development and the body's response to exercise. His work focuses on how resistance training activates critical pathways like mTOR C1 to stimulate muscle growth. And he's also explored the unique molecular responses elicited by endurance exercise. His research spans muscle hypertrophy, tendon and ligament mechanics, even tissue engineering, and is paving the way for advancements in injury prevention and rehabilitation. Dr. Baar, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here. This should be fun.
Yeah. So you're obviously in this world of musculoskeletal development, exercise physiology. Just curious what got you involved in that space.
Yeah, so like most of the people, I know that you've had Marty Gabal on here, like Marty and a lot of the other people who are exercise physiologists.
Yeah.
We started out as kind of okay athletes who probably wanted to be great athletes, and we tried to figure out why we were only okay and not great. And so we've spent a career trying to figure that out. And then as we've gotten older, we've figured, oh, you know what? We should also figure out what happens to the body when you get old and you've got nutritional components, or you're trying to stay healthy as you try and do the things that you love to do.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Well, I want to dive right in, I guess, into some of what you are focused on. And specifically, maybe you could talk a little bit about how resistance exercise activates the mTOR C1 pathway. Maybe just give us a little bit of background on the mTOR C1 pathway and why it's critical for muscle growth.
So this is the mechanistic target of rapamycin. It was identified, fairly long time ago as far as molecular biology goes. And what it is it's kind of a central regulator. So it's a main part of the cell that's determining whether the cell is going to grow or whether it's not going to grow, whether it's going to promote the breakdown of poor mitochondria, the breakdown of other proteins. So it's basically this central location within the cell where you're making decisions as to whether you're going to catabolic states or into anabolic states. So whether you're going to break things down or whether you're going to build them up. And so mTOR is really kind of most famous because it, as an anabolic hub, it is making decisions that are necessary for us to get cancerous cells and other things like that. So mTOR is going to be one of the things that's going to be involved in the development of cancer. It's also really important in insulin sensitivity and other components of kind of how our body is going to signal that there is enough nutrient component. And basically, it's one of the places where we're going to decide which nutrients we've taken in. And our cells will understand which nutrients are taken in because you need two signals to get it fully activated. One is amino acids. And so that amino acids is a central component for stimulating mTOR. The other one can either be done by growth factors like insulin or IGF-1, or it can be done by resistance exercise.
Yeah.
And so
just to stop you for a second, I mean, I think the thing for people who may or may not be familiar, we talked about mTOR before on the show, but just to give like sort of a broad sweeping perspective or framework to understand this. And you can tell me if this comment is fair, Dr. Baar, but mTOR is basically sort of this master switch, which is telling your body whether you should be building stuff up or breaking stuff down.
yes.
And so obviously this is a huge fork in the road, and it has many implications, especially as you've talked about with muscle growth and that sort of thing, but also with longevity. And we'll get back to that as well. But it makes sense, therefore, that if you are focused on the idea of building muscle, you would want to activate mTOR C1.
Yeah,
And
because
is that pretty fair? Yeah.
Yeah, mTOR is going to be involved in regulating cell size. So if I need to build my muscle bigger, I need to activate mTOR complex 1. And I'm going to do that by using this load component and the amino acids that I'm getting from the diet. And so one of the reasons that it's really interesting to a lot of people who are interested in longevity is because mTOR complex 1 is not only important for muscle cells, but it's also important in immune cells. And so for that, chronic inflammation is one of the negative components that we see with aging, and it's an anti-longevity thing. And so a lot of people have gone to taking and there's good evidence in the scientific literature and in model organisms, that if you take a low dose of rapamycin, and remember what mTOR complex 1, the mTOR component, that R is rapamycin, is a target of rapamycin. And so if you take rapamycin and you inhibit mTOR, what happens is you increase longevity in model organisms. And so a lot of people are moving to taking mTOR to try and have this longevity effect. And the reason it has a longevity effect is largely because you're dampening things like chronic inflammation, and you're dampening the likelihood of cancer or other kind of things that are associated with shortening longevity. And so we actually did a mouse study where we fed animals a ketogenic diet. And there what we found is that the ketogenic diet, and remember, a ketogenic diet, you have ample protein, but no carbohydrate in it. Because you don't have the carbohydrate in it, your insulin content in the blood, circulating insulin, stays low. Since we need those two signals to activate mTOR, we're not getting both signals globally. And so the result is that when you give an animal a ketogenic diet, it lives about 13% longer. And so that's very similar to what you see when you give rapamycin, because those two are probably doing very similar things.
Yeah.
They're,
So if
go
I
ahead.
could just interrupt you for a moment, so I think you've identified one of the major pieces of confusion in, I guess, in longevity in general. And maybe you can kind of just drill down on this a little bit for us. On the one hand, you've got this pathway that when triggered, you're building muscle, and there is significant benefit with lean muscle mass and longevity. There's a strong correlation with that. On the other hand, as you've just mentioned, we're taking things like rapamycin in order to down regulate mTOR for all of the longevity related issues that you've talked about. So how should we look at that sort of dichotomy of mTOR, where on the one hand, the muscle mass that we get from it is beneficial, but on the other hand, activation of mTOR has been related with, less longevity?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and really what it is, it's about where you're getting mTOR activity. And so when we do resistance exercise, we actually see a decrease in mTOR activity in certain areas, like our liver and other areas. We see an increase in activity in the brain, but within our muscles that we've exercised, and only the ones we've exercised, we increase mTOR activity there. And so what we're doing is we're actually getting a tissue-specific effect on mTOR activity when we do resistance exercise or when we do endurance exercise, because when we do endurance exercise, we actually turn off mTOR within those muscles. And so now what we're getting a little bit of, but it's, again, tissue specific. So I turn off mTOR in my skeletal muscle. I turn it on in my brain using brain-derived neurotrophic factors. So I actually have beneficial effects on brain protein synthesis and turnover. But in those things like chronic inflammation, which is one of the targets of, pharmaceutical or rapamycin, I am decreasing activity there. So the interesting thing is when I do exercise, I get this big inflammatory signal, and then afterwards it goes way down below baseline, and then it comes back slowly up to normal. What we're trying to do with rapamycin is we're trying to decrease inflammation, or we're trying to decrease some other negative aging related factor that's probably circulating within our body. And so when we do that with rapamycin, we're doing that not only in our peripheral tissues, in our blood and all of these other things, but we're also doing it in our skeletal muscle or our brain. Now, when people take rapamycin pharmaceutically, they're taking a very low dose. And the idea there is that it's enough to slow down or to decrease some of those inflammatory things that are happening in the circulation, but it's not enough to turn it off completely in all these other tissues. It's problematic, though, because it's a very fine line. And if you don't get the dose right, you're not going to get as much of the positive. Well, you're still going to get some of that positive effect on inflammation, but you're going to get some of the negative things that are associated with it as well. And so that's why we don't tend to say, look, this is a really good option for people, because we don't necessarily want them to be taking that low dose rapamycin if there's another way they can do it. Now, if somebody's unable to or unwilling to exercise, that might be an option for them.
So you're saying that, just to be clear, what you're saying is that because there is sort of a mixed effect from exercise, like, there's this effect on the muscles where you are signaling rapamycin, you're basically driving that to be turned on, but because it's simultaneously, exercise has the impact of actually sort of down-regulating mTOR for more systemic purposes, which is what we're trying to do with rapamycin. Is that right?
Yeah. So again, when we do any type of exercise, resistance exercise especially, because there's not a huge metabolic component to it, what I'm doing is I'm turning on mTOR in only the muscles I've worked. So you see this in like a cyclist, because a professional cyclist will walk in and they've got huge legs and little tiny upper bodies. If they were turning on mTOR everywhere, they'd have big muscles everywhere. That's not what they're doing. What they're doing is they're specifically turning it on in the muscles where they're doing heavy resistance type exercise. And in that case, we're getting bigger muscles because now mTOR is active. We can increase protein synthesis rates, and we shift the balance of synthesis to degradation so that we synthesize more. We accumulate more protein within those muscles. Simultaneously, when they're doing that exercise with their legs, and they're not necessarily doing it with their upper body, what's going to happen in the rest of the body is we're going to turn it off because there's other stressors that are coming in. And as a result, well, overall, if we just look at total mTOR activity, it's coming down with that exercise. But if we look at specifically in the muscles we're exercising, it'll go up there, and it's just going down more broadly in all of these other tissues. So what we get with exercise, we get specifically turning on or turning off mTOR, specifically where we want it to happen. When we do it pharmacologically, it's going to happen everywhere. And that's where you get into a bit of an issue.
So when you look at bodybuilders in general, I'm sure there's several other factors playing just other than mTOR, but it is a fairly well-known. Bodybuilders generally don't live as long as they probably would if they did not have excessive, hypertrophy. Is it because of the hypertrophy, or is it because of other drugs potentially? Is it because of IGF-1, growth hormone, all these other things that come into play?
It's most likely because they're taking high levels of anabolic androgenic agents. And those high levels of anabolic androgenic agents are going to have negative effects because we know that the anabolic androgenic effects are to increase stiffness in the vessels and in a bunch of other tissues, resulting in an increase in blood pressure, greater stress in the heart, somewhat pathological hypertrophy of the heart. And that's why most of the people who've taken those anabolic androgenic drugs are actually having cardiovascular issues, which are going to impair their longevity. That's not because they built their muscles. The greatest correlation in humans with longevity of any physiological parameter that's been measured is muscle size and strength. And so if you're in the top third of the population in strength in your middle ages, in your mid-40s, you're 2.5 times more likely to make it to 100 years of age than if you're in the weakest third. We know that if you're in the top third in strength, you're a quarter as likely to die from cancer between the ages of 40 and 60. So muscle mass and strength is not the negative component that you're seeing in a very limited population of people who are doing many other things that are having effects on longevity that are not at all related to their resistance type exercise.
We want to focus on resistance here, but I do want to take a moment at least to address endurance exercise and how it's different and, pathway wise and what kind of benefits we're getting there.
Yeah. So we've done a bunch of things in endurance exercise. And so there you're getting both an increase in mitochondrial mass, but what we also see is that you get a decrease in mTOR activity after endurance exercise in the muscles you've exercised in. And that's important because that's going to be important for mitophagy to break down old mitochondria that aren't working as well, so that when you make the new mitochondria that you've stimulated by endurance exercise, now you're actually going to produce fewer free radicals, and you're going to do a bunch of other things that people in the longevity feel are really excited about. And so the endurance exercise is one of the things that's going to it's going to limit hypertrophy, yes, but it's also going to, by decreasing mTOR activity, it's going to allow you to get better turnover of those mitochondrial proteins, whereas resistance exercise is getting better turnover of the motor proteins, the myofibrillar proteins like the myosins and the actins. And so they're doing two different things within the muscle, but both of them are going to have global effects as well, because the big difference when we do these cyclic exercises that are endurance-based exercises, we're going to have a volume overload of the heart. So that means the heart is eventually going to get bigger, and it's going to have more sarcomeres and series, which means it'll pump out that same amount of percentage of blood that comes into it diastole. So we're getting a larger stroke volume, but we're also getting that regional change in metabolic things. And as a result of those changes in metabolism, we're getting different regional changes in mTOR activity again. And again, when we do that endurance exercise, we're shutting down mTOR activity in our muscles. We're shutting it down in our liver as well, because there's a metabolic stress of the exercise on the liver. We're turning it on in our brain. So these are all different things that are happening locally from tissue to tissue based on whether we're doing endurance exercise where I'm turning it off in my skeletal muscles, turning it off in my liver, and turning it on in my brain. And then when I do resistance exercise, now I'm going to turn it on in my skeletal muscle. And then in my brain, I'm going to have a small but significant increase as well.
You started talking a little bit about diet and keto diets. So let's talk a little bit about that. So keto diets, typically we're talking about high fat, high protein. So going back to hypertrophy and muscle growth, the idea there was, as I recall, that did you say basically you're kind of canceling out the mTOR effect at that point?
No, so with the ketogenic diet, again, what you're doing is because you've eliminated the carbohydrate from the diet, now the insulin component goes away to a large degree. So that means you get a global decrease in inflammation and mTOR
Right.
activity. Now
Okay.
what I do is when I go and I do a resistance exercise, I'm still able to activate mTOR normally with that resistance exercise because I still have lots of amino acids. Now the load takes over for the insulin effect, and now I get a big stimulus to make my muscle bigger and stronger.
Got it.
Because I'm shifting away and I don't have carbohydrate, and the only place that I can metabolize fats, which is the primary fuel source that I have in a ketogenic diet, is in the mitochondria, that's a stimulus for increasing mitochondrial mass. But at rest, when I'm not exercising, again, because overall mTOR activity is lower, I've also got that stimulus that I would get from endurance-based exercise to get rid of the old mitochondria. So now I have an increase in mitochondrial mass so that I can produce energy using the fats that I have, and I'm getting rid of the old mitochondria. And so what we've shown in a number of different papers is that when you do a ketogenic diet in an older individual, what you see is that they maintain their oxidative muscle fibers better. So those are the ones with lots of mitochondria. And those muscle fibers stay bigger and stronger. And in the absence of exercise training, animals on a ketogenic diet are able to actually, in old situation, are actually performing, and their strength is at the same level as an animal who's on a ADA compliant diet.
In that regard, a lot of positive benefits from keto. It's interesting because on the other hand, just from a practical standpoint, muscle itself is quite a bit of volume, is there not, from glycogen stores and just the hydration that goes along with those carbs?
Absolutely. So if you want to perform at a high level, you're going to need to be able to use sugar as a fuel. That sugar is normally stored as glycogen in our muscles. And one of the first things that we do on a ketogenic diet, there's no source of external carbohydrate. So you break down all the carbohydrate that you have within your body. And usually there's about 400 grams stored in your muscle. For every gram of glycogen you have, that's 3 grams of water. So that means that you've got basically about 2 kilos worth of kind of glycogen and associated water. And so what we normally see in most people is they have a rapid drop in body weight, but it's usually because they're just using up that glycogen, getting rid of the water. And so now you've basically had that rapid weight loss, but that's not really weight loss per se. That's just that you've gotten rid of the glycogen.
Yeah.
That's very different than what you're doing on a ketogenic diet. And yes, in many ways, when we look at animals that live longer, again, that's important to remember that that's in mice, and 80% of mice die from cancer. So if you have a diet that's going to inhibit mTOR activity, and that's going to be potentially driving cancer, it's going to have a very big effect in mice where 80% are dying from cancer. The other thing that happens when you do partake in a ketogenic diet, and the one kind of negative thing that we know that we've seen in both in model organisms and in humans, is that your bone mass deteriorates quite quickly. And so the reason why kids who have epilepsy, who are normally put on a ketogenic diet because of the beneficial effects on the brain, are taken off the ketogenic diet is because their bone mass is decreased so much that they're at very, very high risk for fractures. And so what's happening, again, all of these things where we're trying to increase longevity by using drugs or diet, or what we tend to be doing is we tend to be making selections. So I'm going to pick, I'm going to take this, but it's got this drawback, but because of this one benefit that's going to be important for me, that's going to help me. So in my family, all of the men in my family out before my father died by the age of 59 from cardiovascular disease. So they all had heart attacks before they were 50 to 60 years of age. So my dad had a quadruple bypass around that same time. So I know that my family history is one thing. And so now as I'm making decisions based on what's the most likely thing that's going to cut short my longevity.
Yeah.
So that's a bit of the personalization of it, because I don't go in and say, well, I'm going to go on a ketogenic diet because it's going to have great neurocognitive benefits. Well, maybe that's not important in my family, which hasn't had a lot of Alzheimer's disease or other things, but maybe I need to do something that's more focused on the cardiovascular effects. Again, if I combine strength training and endurance training, the positive effects on the heart are quite remarkable, because the strength training results in a pressure overload hypertrophy of the heart, making the heart stronger. And it actually is really important for increasing longevity. And the endurance exercise provides this volume overload hypertrophy of the heart. And that gives me a different adaptation. Both of them together are going to give me as healthy a heart as I can get from just trying to continue to do things using exercise or using kind of things that I can do just in my daily life as I make decisions on how my behavior is going to affect my longevity.
Why don't you just kind of move into some practical applications just in terms of what, people trying to actually get muscle hypertrophy in, by working out. And I'm just curious in terms of protocols, a little bit of science behind the protocols, or people often struggle understanding like how many times per week should I be working out these muscles to optimize hypertrophy? How many sets? And, does it matter if I'm using maximal weight versus, some less weight? Could you talk about some of those sort of practical applications for people interested in muscle hypertrophy?
Absolutely. And it's a lot easier than kind of you would think based on what you see online.
Uh-huh.
So it's actually, the science is quite clear that if I want to get a bigger muscle, I can use any weight that I want as long as I keep lifting until I can't lift it anymore. So I get to what's called positive failure. So as long as I get to positive failure, that's going to be a stimulus, because what happens is if I go to lift a weight, the first time I lift it, I don't have to use every single muscle fiber, say, within my shoulder. So if I'm going to do a lateral raise and raise my hand out to the side, every time I do that, I need to use muscle fibers within that muscle, because there's lots and thousands of muscle fibers within that muscle. But I only use exactly the number that I need in order to lift that weight. As I lift more and more, the first ones I use get a little bit tired. And so what now has to happen is I have to get more and more of those muscle fibers. So when I reach failure, and what that means is I go to lift the weight and I can't quite lift it by myself, that means that at that point, I'm recruiting every single muscle fiber within the muscle I'm trying to use. When I do that, I've given the stimulus necessary to all of those muscle fibers that they need to grow. Okay, so what I tell my students here at university is that the gym, the recreation facility, and specifically the weight room, is the only place on campus where the goal is to fail. Because if you get to failure, you are going to get bigger muscles. Now, if you want to get stronger, you need to lift a heavy weight, and it's a heavy weight for you. So it doesn't mean that you are going to lift the same weight as me, that are going to lift the same weight as my wife, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But what I have to do is I have to lift a weight that's heavy for me. And so really what that means is that by the end of, say, 10 to 12 repetitions, I should be at that failure point. And when I get over, say, 12 repetitions, when I get to 12 repetitions before I get to failure, and so I can do 13, for example, on whatever exercise I'm doing, the next time I go into the gym, I'm just going to increase the weight a little bit.
Right. So the progressive overload.
Exactly.
Does it matter? Like, say, is there greater benefit because of maybe the total amount of work that goes into it to having, 8 to 10 reps versus 4 or 5 reps?
Yeah, so the number of repetitions is largely dependent on a couple of factors. One, the first thing is how many muscles are doing the movement. So when I do a chest press, I've got my big pectoralis muscle, my anterior deltoid, and my tricep all working together. When I do a bicep curl, I have one muscle, my biceps working.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I'm doing those different things, that means that I have a whole lot of muscle mass doing one of these and a lot less muscle mass doing the other. So when I have less muscle mass, that means that I'm going to be lifting a lighter weight usually. And that means that every time I make an increase, the amount of weight that I'm adding that subsequent time is going to be a bigger percentage. Say I'm doing 20 pounds for a lateral raise. If I go from 20 to 25, which is the next dumbbell, now I've gone up like 20% in the weight. If I'm doing a press and I go from 200 pounds to 210 pounds, I've gone up 5% in the weight. So that means that when I'm using lots of muscles, I can have a smaller range. Say 6 to 8 repetitions would be a good range for a muscles like the chest and shoulders. And so if I'm doing a press, or if I'm doing an overhead press, or if I'm doing a pull, those things I'm going to use that I can use a smaller range. And whether you do 6 to 8, whether you do 8 to 10 or 10 to 12, that's less important. It's basically much more about whether you are designed to kind of move that heavy weight and you want to get stronger is a key goal, or whether you just want to stay healthy and have a good stimulus. So if I want to increase my strength to the greatest, I'm going to shift to fewer repetitions. If I want to have, to continue to exercise and feel like there's less likelihood for me to get injury, I'm going to go to a little bit higher repetitions.
But strength, so is there a difference between strength and hypertrophy in this regards? I think what you're telling me is from the standpoint of hypertrophy, it doesn't really matter if you're using heavier weights and lower repetitions versus, more repetitions with lighter weight, as long as you hit exhaustion.
Right.
But for strength, it does matter. Is that
so? Strength, basically, the idea is the heavier the weight, the more you're going to increase your strength. If you get to failure, that's all you need to get your muscles bigger.
Yeah.
So if I want to get big and strong, I'm going to lift a heavy weight and go to failure.
Okay.
If I just want to get strong, I can just lift the heavy weight a couple of times. I'm not at failure. I'm not going to get as much of a stimulus to grow bigger.
And on the opposite, with hypertrophy, you could do either as well.
Well, so as long as you get to failure, yeah. But it's a little bit harder to get to failure when you're really heavy weight. Again, it's how you're getting to failure. So there's the mechanical aspect, and then there's the mechanical plus the metabolic aspect. And what I mean by that is how tired each muscle fiber is. So if I want to get all of the muscle fibers within the muscle, I am going to do that a little bit more effectively when I use a slightly lesser weight, and I can do a few more repetitions because each one gets fatigued because of the metabolic changes. When the weight is just too heavy for me to lift, that's mechanically a limitation. So often what will happen is somebody will be lifting and they'll only get 4 repetitions on a new weight, and they won't feel like they've done as much. And that's because they haven't gotten that same metabolic fatigue through the muscle. And so that's, especially people who like to feel like, oh, I've really worked that muscle hard. Now we're going to go for a little bit longer number of repetitions. The other thing that's really important is when we work our legs, because our legs, first of all, they have way more endurance than our upper body muscle mass. Because most of our stuff being bipedal, we do most of our endurance with our legs. And so what we tend to do is we tend to do longer sets, more repetitions with our legs. The other reason that we do more repetitions with our legs is in order to get the biggest muscle in my body, my gluteus, which is my bum muscle, I have to use, say, a squat or a leg press. And when I do that, the first muscle I'm going to get is my quadriceps. And so that muscle group, the quadriceps are already big muscles. And so what I tend to do is like 20 repetitions for a leg press, because the first 10 are to fatigue out my quads, to get them tired. And then my glutes have to do more work as I get closer and closer to 20. And so what we're doing there is because I often have to use my a movement where I've got a big protective muscle like the quadriceps before I can get to the glutes.
I'm going to tire that out first.
Exactly.
Move on. Yeah. So understood on that. Like, so the other questions that people often have are, okay, so I do that. How many sets do I need?
Right.
And how many times per week do I
Yep,
need to
perfect.
hit it?
So again, so Stu Phillips, who's a good colleague of mine who's at McMaster University, he always kind of says that, look, strength training is a lot like wringing water out of a towel. The first time you wring the towel out, you get lots and lots of water out. And then if you relax and then you do it again, the second time you do it, you maybe get a few drops out. And the third time you do it, you get a little bit less than that even. That's very similar to what happens with strength training. So if I'm going to go in and I can get to failure, because, and again, the important thing there is that in certain exercises that are very technical, so a squat or a snatch or a deadlift, these are very complicated exercises. So in those situations, it's very hard to get to failure because there's all kinds of small muscles who have to do a little bit of a job along the way. If you're using a machine that has a really nice strength curve, you can get to failure quite easily in one set. If the exercise is more complicated, a snatch or deadlift or a squat, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to potentially use more sets. When I personally lift weights, I have a very good set of equipment that I lift. I do one set, I get to positive failure, and that's all I do. The next time in the gym, I'm going to try and get for more repetitions. And if I reach a certain repetition target, I'm going to increase my weight. And it takes me to do my one set, I do my whole body. And it takes me about 25 minutes for myself and my wife to do it together. So she does one, I do one, I do the next one. And so we just alternate back and forth. The two of us together takes 20, 25 minutes. If it's just me,
So it's just
like
one
15
massive
minutes.
set, like
Yeah.
one great big set where you're just not taking that much time in between.
And then I just set up the next machine
Yeah.
and I can go. And what I'll do is I'll move from pushing exercises to pulling exercises. So instead of having to take a long rest, what I can do is I can use muscles that weren't exercising on the last set. So when I do my upper body, I'll do a chest press. Then the next thing is I'll do a pull down. So it's my back exercise. Then I'll do an overhead press. So I've gone push to pull to push. And then I'll do a different pull that uses my bicep to help fatigue my back a little bit more.
So you don't need to wait, or it's not ideal to wait for, a period of time where you're getting complete, like waiting 15 minutes and really waiting till you get most of your strength back again. It's actually better just to kind of keep moving and, exhausting everything.
Again, it's all depends on your goal. If you want to be like the world's greatest power lifter, yeah, you're going to have to take long rests and you're going to have to do the heavy weight. If you're training for longevity in life, you need to have big, strong muscles. It's the strong part that's the important thing. And you can easily get that by just doing the one set, going to failure. Maybe it's a little bit more repetitions than if I was just trying to get as strong as I could. But now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have that as a way that I can do it. And for me, what I'll do is I'll do that twice a week because now I'm in my mid-50s. I don't recover as quickly from each time I train. And so because I'm going to failure, that's what's called a higher intensity training. And so our muscle adaptation is dependent on the frequency of the exercise that we do, so how many times a week, the intensity at which we exercise, and the duration or the length of time we exercise. So when I do a high intensity exercise, I can do shorter duration and less frequency. So if I were to do less weight and more volume, that's a lower intensity exercise, so I could do longer duration and I could do more frequently. But again, like most people in the world, I'm fairly busy. I don't want to have to be in the gym, 5 hours, 6 hours a week just to lift weights. I can do that in 40 minutes, over 2 periods of time.
Yeah.
That allows me to then do all of the other things I have to do, but it still gives me the stimulus I need for those bigger, stronger muscles.
Any other recommendations in general for individuals in the gym?
Yes. So when we're young, if I lift weights today, tomorrow I'll still have higher protein synthesis rates in the muscles I've exercised. Even the next day, often young people will still have more protein synthesis in those muscles. As we get older, what happens is our protein synthesis comes down faster. And so what we have to do is, even though our muscles are more prone to injury and a little bit slower to recover, what we have to do is we have to give them more small stimuli throughout the week. And there, what we've started using a lot is so just some very low intensity isometric exercises. And so there, what we'll do is like a split squat or a lunge, where you'll have one foot in front of the other with a big stride, and you'll go down just about touch the back knee to the ground. And I'm going to hold that isometrically over 30 seconds. I'm going to build to that, but that's what I can do now. And so I can do that on one leg, then I can switch to the other leg. I can do a couple of squats where it's just an isometric squat. And now what I've done in 3 or 4 exercises is I've given an extra little exercise snack, as Professor Gabala would call it. And those exercise snacks, not only are you can do them with endurance, but I can do them with these strength type moves just by using longer hold isometrics. And what that does is it gives me the stimulus in my muscles that I still need to have that high protein synthesis rate to maintain that muscle mass. And I can do that with my upper body. I can do using a bench or my table. I can do an isometric push-up, same type of thing. I can do an isometric pull. And now in 3 or 4 different exercises, I've done a few just isometric holds, and I'll do that on the days that I'm not lifting weights, because that's going to allow me to maintain all of the positive stimuli that I've been giving to my muscles, but it's at a low intensity, and it's at such a low intensity that it's not going to cause your muscles to get more injury, feel heavy. It's going to actually just, if anything, it's going to give you more mobility and better range of motion. So that's what we, especially myself, again, in mid-50s, I'm adding those in much more, because what that's doing is that's giving me all of these positive loading events, and it's maintaining the signal that I'm turning on twice a week with my heavy resistance exercise.
Fantastic. Dr. Baar, how else can we learn about your work? I mean, there's a lot of good stuff here. Is there a resource that people can use just to review some of this stuff?
Yeah. So nice thing is that the medical school here at UC Davis just did a nice video and an article on the isometrics, and I demonstrate the isometrics. I demonstrate 3 of the isometric exercises. So if you go to the UC Davis Health website and you search for Keith Baar isometrics, it'll come up there. If you want to see our research and what's new in the lab and what's new coming out, I use Blue Sky, and there I'm just muscle science. So that's quite nice. If people use LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn. So those are the primary ways that I kind of keep people up to date with the new research that we're coming out with.
Great. Thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been great.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for listening. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe.